Thanks, David. Before I dive in, I just want to share a little bit of context and background. So in my life prior to joining A2, I worked at a nonprofit where I helped us develop the outcomes measures for our strategic plan, and I helped a number of our members develop data-informed strategic planning. So all of these best practices come from my experiences working at an association and working with our members. I was working on these really large 10-year strategic plans. So, the environment we're in is a little bit different, but the learnings and the mindset are still the same. So, when we think about strategic planning and how it is historically done, we tend to see one of three approaches, and it's probably something your organization has done, where either you look at, historic performance, and then you set your goals and your projections based on that. So maybe if you grew 5% last year, you're going to try for 7% this next year. Or you might do something that sounds good, like that appeals to a board member. I've been in a situation where an organization I worked with had a goal specifically because their board chair really liked it, but for no other real reason. Or you may have aspirational goals that sound good to donors, that sound good to your community, but they're not founded in data. And when you take one of these three approaches, it's really just like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And as we illustrate here, when you take that approach, it tends to be really messy because it's not founded in data. And you are maybe using historic data that I think, to Melissa's point, right now, we just can't rely on any further. So what I like to do when you're strategic planning and using data is to have a very different mindset where you're actually working from the back and then backing into your approach. So I like to think about it as a board game analogy. So you know where you want to go, and you have to figure out how to get there. But in order to do that, you have to do a few things. So first, you need to be as specific as possible about your outcome. So saying something like, I want to have constant revenue from this year to last year, thinking about our current environment, that's not specific enough. What you need is something like, I want my revenue to stay constant from last year, and I want to achieve that by moving or growing my revenue in these three streams. And then then you have a very specific outcome that you're working towards. Then what you need to do is think about your data and use your data to actually do a feasibility study. So I think Melissa and Mark, you were really hitting the nail on the hammer and the nail on the head in your examples about using data to identify what is actually feasible, what opportunities do I have to uncover, and then planning based on what the data are saying, as opposed to, based on, this historic thinking, these interests, and so on and so forth. And then the next thing that you really want to do is to think about incremental goals to reach your outcomes. So for long-term plans, like the 5 to 10-year plans, my suggestion is to have incremental outcomes that you're working towards every 2 to 3 years. But in an environment like we're dealing with right now, where our plans are based on maybe 6 to 18 months, I would suggest having incremental outcomes every 2 to 3 months. And the reason for having these incremental outcomes is it allows you to have a progress check to see if you're on track to where you're trying to go. And if you're not, to allow you to pivot. And I think the concept that I've seen a lot of folks in the chat commenting on, and which Mark and Melissa also commented on, was the idea of experimentation. I like to think about failing forward, and having these incremental approaches allows you to do that successfully while minimizing the risks, because it gives you that opportunity to pivot. So that's the thought about how you develop a plan. So you have your plan, and then the next thing that you need to do is to develop your KPIs. So I want to go over a couple of best practices about choosing the right KPIs to track progress against, and then also, thinking about how you socialize those and how you adopt them within your organization. And what we don't want is to be this cartoon where you have all of your really great KPIs and then nobody understands them or knows what they're here for. But in thinking about what the right KPI is, it's really different for every single organization. But I think there's a couple of common threads that makes the KPI valid. And the first is to focus on quantity and quality. And the quantity side of things probably sounds pretty self-explanatory. Most of the metrics that your organizations are tracking your progress against are most likely quantitative. But having quality metrics is also really important because it allows you to measure things like reach of service, member satisfaction, and so on. And this one bullet, I could probably fill an entire hour talking about. So if anybody wants to chat offline about, what is a quantity metric versus a quality, how do I measure quality, feel free to reach out to me directly. The other thing that I feel like goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways, is you need your metrics to be measurable. And again, for the quantity ones, that's pretty easy. Most likely they're coming from transactional data that's stored in your AMS or one of your other platforms. But the quality metrics, it's a little bit more difficult. And what we don't want is we don't want to have a metric that we're using as a KPI that we get to from a number of loose assumptions. And we also don't want to have a metric that is something that was measured years ago and is not measured today anymore. So in thinking about measurable metrics, it needs to, it goes on to this next point. It needs to be from data that is either existing or available. It needs to not be founded in a number of loose assumptions. And it needs to be something that's going to be continued to be tracked or captured during the duration of your plan or the duration that you're tracking this metric. And, building off of that, we need the data to be existing or easily obtained. I've been in experiences where to have successful KPIs, we've needed to bring in new data sources. And if it's something that's readily available, requires minimum cleanup, is an easy integration, I highly encourage using that new data. But if it's something where to get the infrastructure in place and the resources in place to start tracking it is going to be a number of months, I recommend choosing a different metric because you're just losing time on it. And then finally, you want to select both short run and long indicators. And I think in the environment we're in right now, this is really important. So I was thinking about a couple of examples of what this might be. And, I think, again, the long run indicators are more self-explanatory. Those are things like transactions, member retention, sales dollars, those things that we're always going to be tracking toward. But as we're changing up our approach to events, as we're changing up our approaches to member engagement, we need to have some short-term indicators to track against. And these oftentimes are things that are a little fuzzier. So an example I thought of is going off of, what Melissa, you were talking about, and having more virtual events. So whether or not those events are going to be successful in the long run, we don't really know, and we're probably not going to know until closer to the event. However, you can be tracking things like click rates, open rates on the emails that you're sending related to that pivot in your event strategy and seeing if people are, taking the bait. Or maybe in your community, you have posts about that and you're able to look at the chatter and see, are people responding to those posts with a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment? And can those be used as indicators of whether or not the projections that you have for your event are going to be on track based on how your members are behaving in response? So I often suggest that when you're using short-term indicators that they are more behavioral because it's allowing you to potentially predict what is going to happen with that final outcome. So once you have the KPIs in place, really the next thing you need to do is to put them into practice. The first thing you need is you need commitment from leadership. And when I say commitment, I mean two things. So first, you need to decide on the KPIs and then you need to stick with them for a minimum period of time. For long-term plans, I would say 3 years. Again, for shorter plans, I'd say about 6 months. And one thing that's really important to note is when there's leadership turnover, oftentimes one of the things that changes quickly is KPIs. And I would stress that you should steer away from that in your organization because Again, we need them to be tracked for a minimum period of time in order to find out if we're actually being successful. The other part that I mean by commitment is making sure that the individuals and the teams that are responsible for tracking your KPIs, for reporting against them, for communicating them, have the resources and infrastructure that they need, and that it's treated as a priority in your organization. The next thing is to really socialize them and make them meaningful for all. And you can have a lot of fun with this. So I've seen people do strategy roadshows and KPI lunch and learns, or displaying dashboards on the monitors across their offices, and really just getting everyone excited about them. I know that sounds nerdy, but making sure everyone knows what they are, and more importantly, making sure everyone knows how the work that they do contributes to those KPIs and the overall goal that you're working towards. And then finally, you need to adopt them at all levels. And really, this needs to come from above, it needs to come from below, and it needs to come from across the organization. It should be demonstrated that the KPIs are being used to inform business decisions at all levels of the organization, because if you really don't have that adoption, you're not going to have the buy-in or the use, and it's not going to be a successful venture.